Greetings to everyone. Welcome to yet another session of Research Scholar webinar series hosted by Research Committee Maharaja College Ernakulam in association with IQAC Maharaja College Ernakulam. In this session, Krishna Nambiar, part-time research scholar, PG and Research Department of Commerce, will be presenting her topic of interest and research, behavioral finance and behavioral biases, and which will be useful for postgraduate students also who are doing their final year, in which Maharaja University have included this paper as a new item in the 2019 PG syllabus. I welcome the presenter as well as fellow scholars to this session. I should also mention the support of Bindu Sharmila, Dr. Bindu Sharmila, Research Committee Coordinator, Sri Santosh Varghese, IQAC Coordinator in this particular venture. Krishna Nambiar is also an Assistant Professor of Commerce at Behavioural College, Payyanur. I welcome Krishna Nambiar to make the presentation.
Thank you, sir. Good evening, one and all. I am Krishna Nambiar, doing research under the supervision of Dr. Vineet KM, Assistant Professor, Government College, Tripunitura, and my topic is psychological biases and indifferences in financial decision-making of health insurance among households in Kerala. Now, the topic under discussion is behavioral biases in finance. Let me share my screen. Behavioral biases in finance. We have to understand what is standard finance and what is behavioral finance. Standard finance stands on pillars of arbitrage theory by Modigliani and Miller, efficient market hypothesis theory by Eugene Fama, and modern portfolio theory. These mathematical models are the base of standard finance, and all these theories views investors as rational. When anomalies happen, these theories fail to substantiate. Then behavioral finance offers alternatives to all of these. It does not view investors as rational and markets as efficient. It is commonly defined as the application of cognitive psychology to understand human behavior in finance or investing. Standard finance always assumes man as rational, markets as efficient, and rational investors design their own portfolio but fails to answer questions such as why the volume of trading on the exchange is so high, why the markets are so much volatile, why individual investors hold undiversified portfolios, why returns vary across stocks for reasons other than risk, why managers display so much irrationality in mergers and acquisitions, why booms and crashes occur periodically. Here comes the importance of behavioral finance. Why behavioral finance? Behavioral finance views people as normal and markets are not efficient, and people design portfolios by the rules of behavioral portfolio theory, and expected returns of investments are described by behavioral asset pricing theory, where differences in expected returns are determined by more than differences in risk. And bias is a disproportionate weight in favor of or against an idea or thing, usually in a way that is prejudicial. Behavioral finance being the application of psychological principle, cognitive psychology, it is based on some heuristics and biases. It uses to define investment behavior based on some heuristics and biases, and the researchers in psychology identified many psychological biases which can be well used to substantiate why an investor behaves so. According to David Hirschleifer, biases may stem from the following causes: heuristic simplification, self-deception, emotion and self-control, and social interaction. The taxonomy of biases comes like heuristic simplification, familiarity, representativeness, availability, anchoring and adjustment, framing bias, story bias, contrast biases and some other biases, and self-deception, overconfidence, optimism, confirmation bias, hindsight bias, cognitive dissonance bias, self-attribution bias, and in emotion and affect, endowment bias, self-control bias, ambiguity, regret aversion, and in social, conformity, imitation, social contagion, herding plays the role. Given the limitations of time and cognitive resources, we cannot analyze the data optimally. Though effective when applied to appropriate problems, such a heuristic simplification may lead to biases that can be quite flagrant. Self-deception leads to deceiving ourselves. It is a falsehood. And emotions and social influences also stems certain biases. Coming to the familiarity bias, coming to the biases, that is heuristic simplification. First one is familiarity bias. People are comfortable with things that are familiar to them. The human brain often uses the familiarity shortcut in making choices. That a typical example of familiarity bias is that over allocation of our assets as fixed deposits, PPF, etc., and almost no exposure is given to the equity market. And when the investors are asked why you are allocating your assets such that, they may surely they will give the answer that their parents and grandparents do the same, so they are also doing the same, that they are not ready to break the comfort zones. That is what is called familiarity bias. Then coming to representativeness. Representativeness refers to the tendency to form judgments based on stereotypes. It can be well understood with an example that you may form an opinion about how a student would perform academically in college on the basis of how he has performed academically in school. That this may not always be true, that an academically rich student in school may not act very good in college, but there is a representative bias that it is based on stereotype that he will be good at college also. Then coming to availability bias. Availability is a heuristic whereby people make judgments about the likelihood of an event based on how easily an example, instance, or case comes to mind. That is, for example, investors may judge the quality of an investment based on information that was recently in the news, ignoring other relevant facts. This is all about availability bias. And coming to the anchoring bias. It is a particular form of priming effect whereby initial exposure to a number serves as a reference point and influences subsequent judgment. That is, it can be well understood in advertisement, etc. Firms use this for advertising or for launching their product. And Steve Jobs has used anchoring bias wisely for launching his new product iPad. When Steve Jobs introduced the iPad, a device that no one had ever seen before, he put a figure of $999 on screen. He kept the screen in the backyard. He said that the expert had advised it should cost $999. He talked a while, keeping the screen, and then he announced the price as $499. Great jubilation from the audience that the price was only $4,999. That is not $999. That is what is the anchoring bias, and he used it very wisely. And for marketing, every marketing products, firms use this anchoring bias. And then comes story bias. It is also called narrative bias. Our brains constantly construct stories automatically. Stories of how businesses rise and fall. It offers human mind a message of triumph and failure. These stories impart lessons of little enduring value, but induce and maintain an illusion of understanding among readers. Good storytellers know that including specific details is essential to capture the listener's imagination. Story bias is the tendency of investors to view investment through the lens of a narrative, forming a simple story and ignoring the data that does not fit the story. Ignoring the data that does not fit the story. For example, stockbrokers use this. They have taken advantage of the narrative fallacy for years, convincing clients to invest in a stock by telling them a great story about the company. We are used to this. Then coming to contrast bias, for understanding the contrast bias, we need to understand what is the contrast effect. It is a magnification or diminishment of perception as a consequence of previous exposure to something of inferior or superior quality. It can be well understood with an example that when teachers value answer scripts, if the teacher got a paper with too much mistakes and then she got a comparatively good paper, she rates the latter very highly, glossing over some of its shortcomings. That the former paper was very bad, so when she gets a comparatively good paper, she rates it very high. It's because of this contrast bias. And there are some other biases on the heuristic simplification. There are conservatism, which makes people to cling to their prior view or forecast, or personification bias or association bias, which creates a false link with the past. This is all about biases stem from heuristic simplification. And moving on to biases of self-deception. We have to understand what is self-deception. Self-deception means making falsehood. That the well-known economic laureate Adam Smith, in his book The Theory of Moral Sentiments, opined that the opinion which we entertain of our own character depends entirely on our judgment concerning our past conduct. It is so disagreeable to think ill of ourselves that we often purposely turn away our view from those circumstances which might render that judgment unfavorable. That we are not ready to view ourselves as ill. So we purposefully turn away from that view. That self-deception manifests itself primarily in the form of overconfidence. Psychologists say that due to overconfidence, people overestimate their knowledge and abilities, underestimate risk, exaggerate their ability to control things, and often display over-optimism. So overconfidence bias is the supreme faith in oneself, or for example, over-dependence of an investor in a specific industry or stock. It is an example of overconfidence bias. And coming to optimistic bias. Optimism, the belief that the future will be more better than the past and present, is known as the optimistic bias. According to David Kahneman, an optimistic attitude is a blessing. Optimistic play a significant role in shaping our lives. That is why we are behind motivational speakers, and we keep watching motivational stories for getting optimistic. We want to be optimistic in our life. Their decisions make a difference. That they are the investors, they are the inventors, they are the entrepreneurs, and not the average people. But while optimism is a great life strategy, it is not a good investment strategy. Being too much optimistic about a stock or a security, it is not a good investment strategy. For example, it can cause investors to potentially overload themselves with the stocks of those companies in which they are working, assuming that the stocks of other companies are more likely to see the downturn than the stocks which they own. So being optimistic is not a good investment strategy, but it is a very good life strategy. And moving on to the confirmation bias. While taking decisions, we think that our beliefs are the results of years of experience and objective analysis, but the reality is that all of us are susceptible to confirmation bias. As Warren Buffett observed, Charles Darwin, we all knew, the Parinama Siddhanta, used to say that whenever he ran into something that contradicted a conclusion he cherished, he was obliged to write the new finding down in 30 minutes. Otherwise, his mind would work to reject the discordant information, much as the body rejects transplants. For living ourselves, we need the transplanted organs, but the body always try to reject the transplanted organs. Likewise, our mind have a new finding. It comes to new finding, but if we continue thinking, we will reject that idea. So Charles Darwin used to write it down within 30 minutes, otherwise his mind will reject that. This is about confirmation bias. And coming to cognitive dissonance bias. People adore cognitive dissonance. It can be seen as an antecedent condition which leads to activity oriented towards dissonance reduction, just as hunger leads towards activity oriented hunger reduction. For example, if a person purchases a product from the market, considering it to be best featured, but when he gets the information about some other better featured product which he is not owning, he feels a sense of discomfort because of the information. Because of the newly earned information, he has spent his hard-earned money on something other products and he feels discomfort. It is referred to as cognitive dissonance. Then coming to self-attribution bias. The self-attribution bias is also called the self-servicing bias. It's a cognitive process that is distorted in order to maintain and enhance self-esteem. For example, investors consider the gain in their portfolio as an application of their own intelligence, their own expertise in the field, but fall in the value of investment is attributed to bad luck or non-competence of investment manager. That is, good thing happens because of our expertise and intelligence, but bad thing happens because of bad luck or non-competence of investment managers, that we are not ready to reduce our self-esteem. It is what is self-attribution bias. And the last bias in the self-deception is hindsight bias. That people have a tendency to view events as more predictable than they really are. They have a phenomena that it is often regarded as I knew it all along. That I knew it all along phenomena. Thus, this bias is demonstrated in a number of situations involving stock market, politics, and sports. That they knew all it along, so they knew it all along, so they are not ready to accept other one's advice or other information. That is what is about hindsight bias. And then coming to emotion and affect bias. Emotion and affect bias, how it affects the behavioral finance is connected with the emotion and affect. Mental states such as happiness, sadness, pride, greed, fear, etc. are commonly understood as emotions. Emotions may be negative or positive. Negative emotions are anger, fear, stress, sadness, etc. And positive emotions are gratitude, hope, joy, interest, amusement, love, and so on. And emotional intelligence. It can be defined as the capacity for recognizing our own feelings and those of others, for motivating ourselves, and for managing emotions well in ourselves and in our relationship. This is what is about emotional intelligence. And there are some emotional biases also. They are ambiguity aversion bias, endowment bias, regret aversion bias, and self-control bias. Coming to the ambiguity aversion bias, it is the tendency to favor the known over the unknown. It can cause investors to make mistakes such as restricting investments to home country stocks, making conservative investment, etc. That is, they are not clear about the future foreign stocks or foreign investments. So they choose only home country stocks and they are making conservative investments. And coming to the endowment bias, according to standard economic theory, a person's willingness to pay for a good or an object should be equal to his or her willingness to accept disposition of that good or object. In effect, ownership of an asset endows the asset with some added value. That is what is about emotion. When we purchase or when we inherit a property from our ancestors, we added a value of emotion to that product and we are not ready to sell it off. That is what is called endowment bias. For example, investors hold on to securities or assets they have inherited or purchased regardless of whether it is worth holding them. Maybe sometimes it is not worth holding them, but we are not ready to get rid of that. That is what is called endowment bias. Coming to the regret aversion bias. Under conditions of uncertainty, people fear that their decision will turn out to be wrong in the hindsight. So they display regret aversion and try to minimize future regret. For example, investors may hold on to a winning stock for too long, People fear that if they sell, they may miss out future gains. They are not quite sure what will happen in future, but they are not ready to they are not ready to sell off that property, because sometimes they may miss out future gains. That they display a regret aversion and try to minimize future regret. And coming to self-control bias. Self-control bias is the human propensity to consume today at the expense of tomorrow. It causes investors to spend more, and simultaneously investors incur inappropriate degree of risk in their portfolio, which is further more hazardous for them in future. It may also deviate investors from the basic financial principles, such as avoiding compounding interest, which is significant for creating long-term wealth. That is, for example, suppose I have to pay tax within 4 months, that is about 10,000. So I can invest today about 10,000 in my SB account, so that I can get a nominal interest only. But then there is another option that I can turn away Ruba 2,500 in each month, and kept at the end of the 4th month I can pay Ruba 10,000. The latter will be, if the latter is chosen, it is called self-control bias. So here people avoid compounding interest, which is significant for creating long-term wealth. And there are social biases also. These biases seek social acceptances. Individual investment decisions are not made in isolation. They are made in the context of a variety of social factors, such as social interaction, norms, etc. Investing in speculative assets is a social activity that is not done in isolation. Investors spend a substantial part of their leisure time discussing about investments, reading about investments, and gossiping others. So there are the conformity. Conformity is the tendency of people to follow, to conform to the social pressure. And herd behavior is the tendency to follow the behavior of majority to feel safe. Like if in a crowd, if some question is asked and if I knew the answer and the audience is not giving that answer, so I may keep quiet because of fear of social acceptance. This is what is called a herd behavior. And there is also social contagion. These are the social biases that affect people while making investment decisions. So herd simplification, self-deception, emotion, and social biases are these are the some of the social biases. And how can we overcome our psychological biases? The following guidelines are helpful for in mitigating the psychological biases. That is, you understand your bias, you focus on the big picture, you rely on words and numbers and not sights and sounds, you follow a set of quantitative investment criteria, diversify your portfolio, take care of the downside, control your investment environment, review your biases periodically, and rebalance. To conclude, we can master new skills, alter old ones, overcome crippling emotions, and through experimentation, teach ourselves psychological responses and styles that can become automatic. Thank you. I thank each and everyone for giving me this opportunity. I thank Dr. Vineet KM, my research supervisor and guide, for the academic and mental support. I thank Research Committee and IQAC Maharaja's College for this wonderful opportunity. I thank Dr. Suresh Sir, HOD Commerce Department, other faculties, scholars and guides of Commerce Department, and my co-research scholars, Neil teacher, Shabna teacher, and Induleka for hosting the event, and all the listeners. Thank you.